Hello everyone, welcome to the Development Economics course week 7. Um, from this week onwards, we will talk about certain structural constraints faced by developing countries and how they may go about relaxing those structural constraints in the economy in the process of development. So, in the midterm period, we were primarily focused on the phenomenon of poverty and poverty reduction and issues about poverty traps, etc., and how various kinds of policies in the form of distributive policies such as public welfare program like the NREGA or the public distribution system that we have in India and in many other countries can help alleviate some of these issues with regard to unequal distribution of income. However, uh, there might be other structural and market features or features of the environment of the economy that can result in unequal distribution of income due to various inefficiencies that these structural constraints impose on individuals. And one way that we can one way we can address these structural inequalities um, is first by understanding the various aspects of these structural constraints that we face in the economy in developing countries and what kind of policies may try to relax them and whether or not policies that have attempted to relax these structural constraints have succeeded in achieving these goals of improving efficiency and betterment of economic performance, etc. So, for the coming 3 to 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about various aspects of these constraints or looking at various markets and see what kinds of constraints that uh, 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 agents in developing economies face. And this week, we're going to be talking about the land market. Specifically, we will be thinking about property rights and imperfect protection of property rights from the point of view of land market. Okay? And we want to understand to what extent imperfections in the land market, in the sense of imperfect security of property or imperfect protection of property rights of titles to land, can lead to inefficiencies and underdevelopment in countries like ours. So, as many of you probably already have a sense of, protection of property rights is a fundamental aspect of any developed economy. So if you go to any developed country, in all of these countries, property right and its sanctity is of fundamental importance. You cannot the state's machinery will act on you very heavily if you try to violate someone else's private property rights. And these kind of strict protection of private property rights, uh, it has implications in terms of performance of individuals who use various assets for their private economic activity. And therefore, if there are property rights which are imperfectly protected, or there is some sort of uncertainty with regard to the extent to which the states will protect someone's private property or assets, it may hamper those individuals owning those assets to use them for their best or most efficient or productive usage, which can have sort of broader implications for economic performance and development. So therefore, sort of thinking more concretely about, say, land ownership, which is sort of a primary asset that developing countries, which are primarily agricultural in nature, uh, uh, are based off, where ownership to land is sort of the main assets that individuals in developing countries mostly can use in order to generate their income. Uh, Protection of rights or formalization of rights over land ownership is going to be critical for during the process of development. Now, what are the issues with regard to this protection of rights over land? So when we are thinking about protection of rights over land, we will primarily be thinking about states' capacity to register these rights formally in some sort of national registry, which requires government officials to go and survey these lands, create documentation, and sort of maintain some kind of formal registry of these titles of ownership, which will facilitate further trade. So if then I have to sell some piece of land that I own to somebody else, that would also require transfer of these rights in the form of documentation and a registration to the person that I'm selling the land to, and these things will get recorded in the official registry. So these kinds of formal process of registration of titles over land is a costly process. States needs to invest in creating institutions that will document these kinds of titles and give these kinds of formal documentation to individuals. And so not all states do it, and systematically we know that countries that are poorer are developing, less developed, they tend not to invest a lot in these kinds of institutions. And therefore, historically speaking, as countries, countries when they are sort of at the initial stages of development, tend to have insecure rights over their land, which is sort of their primary productive asset. So let's talk about the various sources of this inefficiency that can arise from insecure property rights over land. So the first is that if your land is not if you do not have a formal title over your land, i.e. you do not have a formal documentation provided by the government with proper registration of the title with the national, some kind of national registry, then you face the risk of expropriation of this property or this land. So when you do not have this kind of formal titles over land, you face the risk that either some other individual may come and expropriate it because the person is, say, more connected or is powerful, or just by brute force can evict you, or you can face the same risk of expropriation from the government itself, right? So the government can suddenly declare certain land to be government land, and then come and expropriate that land from the people who are residing there and throw them out. And we see that happen quite frequently in urban areas in India, for example, where certain slum areas will be declared government land and to be used for certain purposes, and therefore the government will come and sort of uproot these people from their residences. Okay? And these kinds of expropriation can therefore happen from the government side as well. So that sort of is the first the first risk that you have faced when you do not have formal titles to land. If you face the risk of expropriation, your productive asset can sort of, you may lose the productive asset. So that's the first set of inefficiency. The second is that if you are a cultivator who are using this land to generate agricultural output, this kind of expropriation risk can hamper long-term investment that you can put in the land to increase agricultural productivity. So if you face this kind of expropriation risk, you may be less willing to invest heavily on the land to make it more productive in future. Okay. So that's sort of from the cultivator's point of view. For somebody who wants to get out of this agriculture and move to some kind of, say, high skill occupation by getting educated more and going into some kind of high skill occupation, for that person, that person may be willing to rent out the land that he or she owns and can sort of switch, make this switch to other occupations. But if he or she sort of faces this risk that the land once rented out, he or she may not claim it back because property rights are insecure, and the person who rents the land may suddenly start claiming property rights over it. Then you may be less willing to rent out land to other people and move to occupations in which you may be earning better returns. So you may be stuck in agriculture for a much longer time than you otherwise would have if you could sort of rent the land out easily without worrying about whether your land will be expropriated later, right? So this leads to some kind of misallocation of talent. So for example, suppose I own some piece of land, but I would like to sort of move to some other occupation where I would perform probably much better than as a cultivator. But if there are insecure property rights, I may not do so, right? So I may be stuck in agriculture even though I earn a lower return on it, given my effort, as opposed to in some other occupation where I probably would earn much better. So these kinds of misallocation of ability across occupations or talent across occupation can arise at a sort of a large scale, at a national or societal scale, if these kinds of property rights are not secured. Then, because then people will not be ready to engage in market transaction in the land market, because they're worried that once they sort of get rid of the land, they lose it forever. Um, the third aspect is that a secure property right can also free up labor, because in order to, in a world where property right is not secure, you may be you may have to sort of be around the land all the time to ensure that the land is not expropriated away by somebody else. Okay? So that sort of also hampers your mobility, in the sense that you may not be able to go out and work in some, say, nearby town, because if you keep doing that, you may have to keep your land empty, and that sort of opens it up for expropriation by others. So this I'll talk about in the context of a paper in a couple of slides from now. But this idea that ensuring that your property remains yours in a world where property right is not protected by the state requires time investment. So you have to sort of be around the piece of land all the time to ensure that it's not taken away by somebody else, or it's not encroached upon by somebody else. Okay, and that can sort of restrict mobility. But if state comes in and formalizes the title and therefore ensures some kind of protection by the state, then it sort of frees you up to move to other locations for pursuit of better job opportunities. Okay? So it can sort of free up labor in that sense. So any development process therefore would require formalization, some kind of formalization process initiated by the state that will help ensure formal titles over land, which is sort of is the primary asset again owned by developing countries at the process of development. And through that initial investment by the state in the formalization process of land titles, it can sort of start formalizing and ensuring property rights over other private properties as well, and not just over land. So that sort of is the idea. And so many developing countries across the world have engaged in this formalization of land titles. So they have embarked on this kind of massive exercise of giving formal titles to lands to a lot of people. So therefore, many economics researchers have gone in and tried to estimate whether these kinds of formalization of land titles lead to changes in behavior of the economic agents, and whether it improves efficiency, production, better allocation of labor, etc. Right? So we're going to look at two examples today. And so the first one is the context of Peru. So that will be in the context of urban titling. So titling of uh, 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 s- uh, titlings of land in urban informal settlements, squatter settlements. And the second is the tenancy reform in West Bengal in 1977. So that's in the context of rural or an agricultural setting. And on Thursday, we will discuss the paper on Vietnam, which is also in the context of rural title. Okay? And there are other papers that have looked at reforms in Pakistan. There's a very recent paper in the context of Pakistan, which sort of looks at computerization of these land records and its effects again on agricultural activity and land renting in and out. So it looks at the land market activity. And then there are papers on Mexico and other countries as well. So various countries, developing countries, have done this, and then there are various papers that have tried to estimate the effect. Okay, so the first paper is on Peru. So the reference is this paper by Erika Field in Quarterly Journal of Economics, and we're going to be discussing this paper in the context of what happens to labor supply, allocation of labor across market versus home production, when these households get formal land titles. So this is the we're going to be looking at the consequence of formalization of land titles and its effects on labor supply misallocation or more efficient allocation. So as you may be aware, urban informal settlements are a feature of many developing countries. So as developing countries get more and more urbanized, uh, the the rural urban migration also increases over time because a lot of these sort of new opportunities of income generation opportunities are sort of located at the various urban centers of the developing countries, and so sort of people flock there, and so that resulted in various quarter settlements on the peripheries of major cities around the world. And so this is sort of quite common from Delhi to Rio de Janeiro to the context that we are looking at, which is sort of cities in Peru, such as Lima. So this is sort of true in Peru as well, where informal settlements have grown over the sort of the second half of the previous century, and in many cities in Peru, they are sort of surrounded by a lot of barren land, which are sort of government land, and as rural urban migration grew due to various reasons in Peru, people started flocking and settling down in these, started occupying these barren lands and settling down there in search of work in urban areas. Moreover, various housing policies by the Peruvian government in 1980s even allowed squatter settlements on unused government land. So these sort of were these kinds of processes were in some way recognized by the state by allowing people to use government land to settle down, even though they were, there was no formal title given, but legally it was kind of allowed for people to do that, which actually increased further migration to the cities. So the rural urban migration, in fact, intensified following these kinds of policies, which then got reversed in 1990s to some extent. But anyways, the issue is that in around many cities in Peru, there is this issue of large urban settlements. About a quarter of the city population at some point in early 2000 or late 1990s were living in these kinds of informal squatter settlements, sort of similar to Delhi. So in 1996, the Peruvian government began this reform, legal and regulatory reform, to formalize land titles in 8 cities. So what is the idea? The idea was to basically go in, survey, and give formal titles to households who have been living in these squatter settlements for a certain number of years. So this legal reform in Peru is known as the Decree 424, the law of the formalization of informal properties. And as part of this reform, a new government agency was created. So this agency is called COFOPRI, COFOPRI. This new agency embarked on this process of implementing this formalization. So before this reform and this agency came into being, the previous process was highly expensive for, so suppose in the period previous to this reform, so the pre-1996 period, if any household in these settlements wanted to get formal title, they would have to go through various agencies and do a lot of paperwork in order to get a title. So it was not possible for most people living in these settlements to get formal titles. The new process under this new agency, on the other hand, was virtually free. So they would in fact show up in the neighborhoods to do the process, and it will be rather rapid. And so it was kind of virtually free and quite fast. So how they would do it? So this agency would have teams that would in each city go into various parts of the cities where these kinds of these kind of informal settlements were present, and they would go into various neighborhoods in each of these parts and do a series of steps through which, at the end of which, there will be formal titles being given to households living in these neighborhoods. So they'll go in each neighborhood. So it's done neighborhood by neighborhood, and so they'll go into each neighborhood. They'll first establish the claims of these households living there. And they'll delineate and map the properties, the pieces of land that each household is sort of claiming ownership of. Then confer those titles in a span of 5 to 7 weeks. The registration of this title into the national registry, that takes more time. That takes about 1 to 6 months. In which case they'll be sort of formally registered in the national registry as owner of properties. But the titles will be given in the form of some kind of documentation from the government in a matter of few weeks. Okay? So this entire process was initiated in 8 cities in Peru, and by December 2001, so in sort of about 5 years, 1.2 million residents became owners of formal property who didn't have formal property in the urban settlement. So it was sort of one of the largest urban land titling program in the developing world. So, as I've already mentioned, in these kinds of scenarios where in urban settlements, when people do not have formal titles to land, uh, there are two sources of inefficiency that arise from the tenure insecurity that they have. The first is the eviction from the government, because government can suddenly one day come and claim part of the land which is sort of already is a government land for some public purposes, and evict them. The second is that someone else, some other resident may engage in property theft, okay? Because you do not have formal titles. You cannot take legal recourse if somebody does it. And the idea is that both these kinds of tenure insecurities would reduce labor supply by individuals to the formal market, formal labor market. So what is the idea? The idea is that informal claims over land, over your piece of land, is maintained through some kind of community policing. So the idea is that the community will watch over each other's piece of land and try to stop any kind of encroachment by some third party. Okay, but that requires time investments, right? Because we have to be around to police each other, and when these kinds of informal settlements come in and initiate, they, in the initial period of their settlement, there might be some kind of understanding that we will be around this neighborhood to ensure that our this sort of very recent claim to this new barren land is not threatened by some, either the government or by some other group of people. So a social norm may emerge after these groups, sort of come and occupy this land, that we have to be around and will punish people in our community who are not around, who are always trying to move to some other place for some work or something, right? So the idea is that when these informal settlements come into being, there might be informal norms among people living in that area, that they will be around most of the time to ensure that each other's property is safe from encroachment, which sort of can further hamper an individual's ability to go out regularly to the city to work. And remember that these kinds of neighborhoods are on the sort of peripheries, and therefore commuting time to the cities where you will find job opportunities, it takes time. So you have to be away for the entire day if you have to go to the city to do work and come back home. So you have to be away for the entire day from your home, and that may not be possible given that you have this sort of informal understanding that you will look after each other's property. So in that sense, living home can be both risky because it can be encroached upon because you are not around, but it also could be seen as breaking the community norm because you are supposed to be around, and so that can lead to some kind of informal punishment for breaking this kind of community norms. Now, formal titles, relieves individuals from these kinds of informal understandings with each other. So it sort of frees them up to go out and work in the city, and so therefore earn some a better wage from the market, rather than staying at home and trying to do some economic activity from home. So how does the author go about testing the effect of this titling program? So she surveys a random sample of 2,750 households in March 2000. So this is about 4 years after the program started, and it was sort of in midway around the program. So the program hadn't finished titling everybody by that time. Anyway, so that's something that she's going to use for identification. So what she does is it's a random sample of households, but this random sample is collected in a sort of stratified manner. So she goes to all the 8 cities where this program started, and within each city she sort of randomly selects neighborhoods, and within each neighborhood randomly selects some individuals. Okay, so she has sort of a representative set of households from each neighborhood for a cluster of neighborhoods from each city across these 8 cities. And what she's going to use as to identify the effect of titling on labor supply is this process of staggered titling of neighborhoods. So not all neighborhoods got the same title at the same time. In fact, by March 2000, when the survey took place, there were some neighborhoods that didn't receive the title yet. So their titling happened after the survey. So they've formed the primary control group because they are not yet treated by the act of titling, even though these people know that titling might happen sometime in the future. And the others are the treated group, right? Because they have already received the title. And within the treated group also there is variation in the length of of treatment, because the survey happened in March 2000, but people, neighborhoods received title during the period from 1996 to 1999, or even to January 2000, right? So she's going to use that information, this exposure to how long you have been exposed to formal titles, also as to check whether being exposed, owning a title for a longer period of time has a greater effect or not. So this is the map of the capital of Peru, Lima, and it is showing various neighborhoods that received these titles, or where this program was implemented. Um, and these lines are basically how various teams that went into these neighborhoods, how they sort of uh, how they progressed this titling process from one neighborhood to the other. So this is sort of tracking the movement of each team from that agency across various neighborhoods in a region of the city. And so, as you can see, these kinds of urban settlements are scattered across various parts of the city, and there are various teams that start this process around the same time in various directions. Okay, and then there are these white regions here, white regions, which are basically in the control group. They were not treated by March 2000, so they were treated later. And then there are various colored areas to signify how early was the titling process in these neighborhoods. So if you want to use sort of staggered exposure to the land titles, then you have to ensure that the areas that got title versus the areas that didn't get title are similar. So some kind of, these two groups of neighborhoods that got, those who got title initially versus those who got title later are similar in some way. Otherwise, any sort of treatment versus control comparison would lead to biased estimates. So the author's first point is that there is no systematic socioeconomic characteristics that were used to title, to provide the titles in some neighborhoods early than some other neighborhoods. They basically followed neighborhoods in various parts of the city at the same time, and they kind of followed on certain direction. And so in terms of socioeconomic characteristics, there is not much difference between early, the neighborhoods that got titles early versus neighborhoods that got titles later. To show this, they look at this program versus no program neighborhoods. So program neighborhoods are one that got title by March 2000, and no programs are the neighborhoods that got title after the survey was done. And it's looking at various socioeconomic characteristics, and it's looking at the mean difference in the means of these two groups of neighborhoods. And it's basically what they're saying is that the groups are very similar. For example, it's looking at, in the municipal election, what fraction of voters voted for a candidate from the president's party. It's very similar. Or the poverty index are very similar. Or illiteracy is also very similar in the two groups. So in terms of various socioeconomic characteristics, they seem to be very similar groups. The question is, first, did this act of titling increase tenure security as perceived by these households living in these neighborhoods? And then the second question is, does that lead to changes in labor supply? Okay. So here is the first result in terms of whether titling increased tenure security. So the first question is, do you have a property title? And it's looking at two kinds of households that were squatter, basically meaning that households that did not have formal title uh, during the pre-program period, so they are called squatters. And then there were households that had title in the pre-program period. So they are called they are called pre-program title. And so obviously, if they had title in the pre-program period, they already 100% of them, both in the non-titling program areas as well as titling program areas, would have title. Among the squatters, however, you see nobody has title in the no titling program, but about 72% of those households have formal titles in the areas, in the neighborhoods that were exposed to the titling program, right? And that in turn, if you look at do you consider dwelling currently at risk of eviction or invasion, you see that the areas that were exposed to titling, this percentage is much smaller among the squatter relative to non-titling relative to the squatters among the non-titling. So about 44% of the squatters in the non-titling, non-exposed areas say that they face a risk of eviction, while it's only 16% in the areas that were exposed. Okay. Even the households that had title in the pre-program areas, even there is a difference. So even them who even those with title living in areas that were not exposed to the titling program, about 20% say they face risk of eviction, while it is only 9% for the similar people living in the areas exposed to the program. Okay. So they sort of, you can use difference in difference to show that this risk of expropriation goes down due to the title among the squatters, and their and for the other question, sort of the opposite question, do you consider dwelling currently very secure from eviction? That difference in difference estimate is now positive and significant, meaning that the squatters in the titling program disproportionately now feel secure of their own dwelling, thanks to the titling program. Okay, so basically the idea is that here it is, the author finds that titling indeed increased tenure security. So then the author estimates, the main result, which is what is the labor supply, the weekly labor hours from household I in neighborhood J in city K, uh, to what extent these labor hours get affected by the program, uh, especially for households that are squatters. So squatter refers to a household with no pre-program property title. So the squatter households in the program area, whether they disproportionately start supplying a greater labor now that they have, now that their tenure security have increased, as we observed in the previous table, right? So this is a difference in different specification. So you have squatter versus non-squatter, and program versus non-program areas. So you have both squatters and non-squatters in both program and non-program areas. But the idea is to check whether the squatters in the program area provide more labor than squatters in the non-program area relative to the non-squatters. Okay? Controlling for various characteristics of households and neighborhoods. Okay? So beta 5 is the estimate of the program effect. So beta 5 is the difference in difference estimate. So that's the program effect, because program is supposed to have an effect on the squatters because they are the ones who didn't have title before. So beta 5 is these are sort of coefficient of interest. So squatter times program, you see that in the first column, you find that squatters in the program area provide on average 13.5 hours per week more labor. So this is sort of market labor, right? So this is market labor against which they are earning wages. So just because of titling, they are now earning greater amount of income, right? So because they feel more secure about their own dwelling. In column 6, they also interact with program period. So basically, how long you have been exposed to the program. So that's actually positive, which tells you that being exposed to the program for a longer time gives a squatter more security, and therefore those households are providing more labor. So they're supplying more labor every week. If you normalize it by the household member who are sort of in this age group 5 to 69, that's also positive, but that's not statistically significant. When you look at length of exposure, that becomes statistically significant. So basically hours per member of this age group, there's greater supply per member, thanks if they are exposed to the program for a longer period. Okay, and now these first 7 regressions, they have city fixed effects, meaning that there is a dummy for every city, and in column 8 and 9 there is a neighborhood fixed effect. So now it's basically differencing out all pre-programmed differences across neighborhoods, right, even within cities. So it's basically comparing individuals within neighborhoods, and it's checking whether neighborhoods, when they get exposed to the program, whether the people living in those neighborhoods increase labor hours, and they find that indeed it does, and the coefficient is very similar both with city and neighborhood fixed effects. So if you compare column 1 and 8, the coefficient is very similar, 17.5 versus 13.4, right? So putting neighborhood fixed effects doesn't really change the coefficient by a lot. In fact, this exposure column 9, where you interact with the length of the program, that also give you a similar estimate as column 2, and it's also statistically significant. When you break up the work location, so whether so it asks whether the residents used, so whether the household used their residence for economic activity versus whether the household member commutes more than 2 hours for work. You find that here it's a negative effect. So now basically the households, squatter households in the program areas, they're less likely to use their own residence for economic activity, and they're more likely to commute longer duration for work. So basically that's the reallocation of labor, right? This is the main idea, that when you get secure tenure rights, you reallocate your nature of economic activity. You stop working from home, so to speak, doing sort of this informal economic activity from home because you have to be around, and you start going out to the city for better income earning opportunities, right? So then you start commuting home. So these is the kind of change in behavior that's sort of is exciting. That tells you that this kind of formalization process can have large effects, because people will start sort of allocating their labor in more productive activities. So not only they are increasing total hours of work, but they are also changing the nature of the work as well. So these two things are happening, right? And both lead to better income earning, better income for these households. So these kinds of formalization process, and this is a one-time process, right? So once you get a title, this is going to stay for a long time, and therefore it has long-term consequences. So that's why these kinds of structural changes in the way your economy is organized can have long-term consequences for development. Okay, so that's the idea. The author also finds that the investments in house also goes up among the squatter households once they receive the title. So once they receive the title, if you follow the program versus non-program areas, they sort of, if you plot the annual number of house renovations, that seems to be going up much faster than than these areas, and than the control group. So this basically tells you that you know uh, that they'll start investing in their home. They'll probably live in a better home now that they have a more secure dwelling, right? So their welfare levels also go up, not just because of course they're earning more money because they're providing more labor and doing better economic activities, but they're also using part of the money to renovate their home, and they're sort of the standard of living is also going up because they're investing in their homes. So these kinds of also changes can happen. So this is sort of a positive story, nice positive story of urban titling program, and these kinds of urban titling program has happened in other countries as well, especially in say Mexico. And this is sort of it has important implications for countries like India as well, where these kinds of urban settlements are a feature of our major cities, and therefore we can also think about policies that give formal titles to these people. If you remember, right before the recent Delhi election, the there was an announcement that all the slum dwellers will get formal property titles. It was sort of a way to get try to attract votes from these people. But nonetheless, this was kind of promised, and it will be interesting if Delhi kind of embarks on this kind of formal title process, and we can see whether that leads to these kinds of changes in activities of the people living in these areas. So in the next video, I'll talk about the West Bengal experience.